Great, and we should be live. And howdy, everybody. We're going to give this a minute so we can let some people join in. All right. Hello to anybody that's out there watching. This is our first reporter debrief. I am Northwest Public Broadcasting News Director Geoff Roth, and today I am joined by reporter Lauren Gallup. Lauren has been working on a series of stories called The Fight for Legacy Forests. We've published several of them already, and we'll be publishing several more on our website. But we just wanted to take a little while to, kind of talk about the story. And if, as we get into this, you want to ask Lauren any questions, you can ask a question by posting it in the comment section of the Facebook page. And we can put those questions up, and she'll try and answer those as well. So let's start out, Lauren. Just first of all, what is a legacy forest?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you asked that question, Geoff, and hi to everyone as well, because the term legacy forest, in my understanding with my reporting, is actually a fairly new term, and some environmental groups have taken it on. There's even a neighborhood group that uses legacy forests in their kind of conservation efforts, and my understanding of what it means is it's these trees and forest stands that were harvested but harvested prior to World War II, because around the same time that World War II happened, there was a lot of technology changes with how we harvest timber. So, you could cut down bigger trees. You had different power tools that loggers could use. And so that changed a little bit timber harvest, and you're able to do these bigger harvests. So the trees that might have been logged before that, these legacy forests, first of all, not all of the trees were cut down. There wasn't this clear cutting, which the Department of Natural Resources in Washington doesn't do clear cutting anymore. But when there was able to be these bigger swaths of forests cut down after World War II, before that there would be maybe these really big trees left, and they also didn't do certain practices and even replanting practices. So the forest would naturally regenerate after they were logged before that time. And so people say legacy forests because they have a legacy of these older forests. And I think I talk about this in the first story in the series, but like I said, legacy forest is a fairly new term. And so it's not widely accepted. Most people will say older forests or naturally regenerated forests still, but the term legacy forest has been really kind of important in this whole story, because it's showing that maybe people might be coining this new term and talking about forests in a different way, but just all thinking within this conversation about conservation and when do we start considering something old and naturally regenerated. And that kind of goes along with a lot of folks' concerns.
Okay, and how is that different from the terminology old growth forest?
Right. So old growth forests, really widely accepted by Jerry Franklin, scientist who's fairly well known for kind of figuring out and defining that term. Old growth in Washington state were never logged. So they're forests that prior to any sort of Western logging practices, they existed and grew before that. And I think for Douglas firs, which is a really common tree in our area, they have to be about 150 years old or older. So they're really old, those huge trees that do also have a legacy.
And when it comes to sort of the difference between the term old growth and legacy forest, how does that affect the decision? Well, actually, before we get into that, why don't you talk a little bit about the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, and what their mission and their mandate is for managing the state's forests?
Certainly. Well, and first I'll just say too, to clarify, because I think with this conversation about old growth versus legacy forests, so DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, has a policy to not harvest any old growth. So that's something that they look for when they're doing timber harvests, and that's a long held practice for them, and it's on the books and on the record. So just to start there, but backtracking a little bit, let's talk about why the DNR does these timber sales. So the DNR manages our state trust lands, and the trust lands, some of them were granted in the Enabling Act when Washington became a state, and then there's others that were given to counties and then to the state to manage around the same time as the Depression. And so what these trust lands do is they generate revenue for specific beneficiaries that are all public institutions in Washington state. So K-12 schools, universities, junior taxing districts if you live in a rural area. So they support a lot of services through the revenue that DNR can get from selling some of the forested lands for timber harvest. And that's something that's laid about in the state constitution. And I talked a little bit about that in I think the second story and then the third story too, because what we just reported on this week was that that interpretation in the Constitution, that the DNR is entrusted basically with managing these trust lands. There's a line that says, for all the people in Washington state, in summary. And environmental groups have said, you're not managing the lands for all the people if it's specifically for trust beneficiaries. But the DNR's argument is that that's the way that they've interpreted the Constitution for always. And there's some legal precedent for that too. So the reason why the DNR does timber harvest is even right now being kind of clarified and, researched into, I guess I would say, in the state Supreme Court. So yeah, does that answer your question, Geoff?
Yeah, sure. So, basically there's an argument going on about what the actual mission is for the DNR's management of those lands and what they're supposed to be doing with it. So, and I know in your series of reports, you're talking about lawsuits that have been filed. So who's filing these lawsuits and why are they filing the lawsuits?
So what I mostly focus on in my reporting is 6 lawsuits, which are against 6 individual timber sales. And I think that we haven't, those stories will come out soon in the next few weeks, where there will be a lot more detail because those cases are ongoing and there's a lot of moving parts. But basically these 6 lawsuits were by this one organization, the Center for Responsible Forestry, who is specifically suing the DNR over these 6 timber sales because of the way that the places where these timber sales are, they think exemplifies how the DNR might not be following certain of its policies. So we'll talk a little bit about the policies quickly too. So the DNR, when they do timber harvest, they have to follow certain environmental regulations and timber logging practices basically. And Washington as a state has a fair number of those on the books, as does the United States government. And one of these is a habitat conservation plan, which the DNR first created in 1997. And the reason for that is to ensure that when they're taking from certain lands that interact with endangered species, that they are protecting those species and conserving them in the way that they must federally. And there's a lot of little intricate parts of that plan. But within these, the reason why that's relevant to these lawsuits is that the Habitat Conservation Plan sets about basically projections or ideas of what age certain forest areas and what percentage of those areas and ages the state will have after 100 years of implementation of the HCP. And the Center for Responsible Forestry is arguing that that's objectives that the DNR has to meet by following this habitat conservation plan. And the DNR has said, well, those are, goals that we think we will meet and we're, kind of planning to meet. We don't have to. There's no binding agreement to do that. And however the courts interpret that would kind of affect maybe some of DNR's practices. And this is all just to clarify on the west side of Washington state. So looking at forest ages over here where I'm at.
All right, and I understand there's a certain bird that's also involved in all of this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like I just said a few moments ago, the DNR created their HCP in 1997. And when they established that, there was a part that hadn't yet been completed, and that was for the marbled murrelet, which is a seabird. It's an endangered species, or sorry, a threatened species. And they hadn't completed that yet. They were wanting to do some more research on the bird. And that amendment to the HCP just got completed in 2019. And that's a really interesting kind of piece of, and maybe where this story began, because when they finished the amendment for the marbled murrelet, that changed which lands were being conserved in order to protect that species, follow this Endangered Species Act. But what that meant is some of these older forests, what folks call legacy forests, that had been conserved kind of in the research and deciding what was needed for the bird, those were found by the DNR to not be as necessary for habitat. So they were removed from conservation. Maybe some younger forests got put into conservation in terms of where habitat is and where they're hoping to expand habitat. And so now some of those older forests that maybe folks, had seen conserved and were enjoying near their homes, now those are some of the forests that are up for sale.
Right. Kind of, take us a little bit through the process. Like, how long of a process is it when the DNR identifies, a certain area that they're going to, put up for timber sale? How long does this process take? What is involved in that process? How do they decide, who gets the rights to harvest the timber?
Right. Yeah, so I think the DNR usually says it's about 2 years. That's a good estimate for when they set out to do a timber sale from the time that it actually goes up for auction. And so that process involves a lot of environmental checklists, making sure they're following the HCP. They identify when they're going to leave trees. So there's a lot of preemptive work. The department every decade sets a sustainable harvest calculation level. So that's, how much acreage basically, or I think it's defined as million board feet of timber that they plan to harvest over the next decade. And that's to sustain the revenue for trust beneficiaries and also within all these environmental checklists. So when they set that kind of broad stroke, big number, at the decade, that identifies, how much maybe is going to be harvested in some areas. And then they'll go in and prepare these timber harvests. And that's, when it starts to take about that 2-year time period for field scientists to be looking just for any environmental factors that might need to be stabilized, watersheds that need to be protected and such. And then the Board of Natural Resources actually gets to look over all of that information and approve timber sales. And the BNR has monthly meetings that are open to the public. And that's when they do their approval of timber sales. And then after the board approves those sales, that's when they go up for public auction. Since it's state, it all has to be done publicly and have public bidders and such. So that whole process is usually about 2 years.
And we have a question from Connor. It's, once the DNR sells land, is it ever possible to reclaim it for the public? Has it ever been given or bought back?
Yeah, that's a great question, Connor. Thanks so much for asking. Because there was a timber sale that was approved. Let's see, I'm trying to remember the name of that specific sale. And then it was identified to have old growth in it. And this was about 2 years ago now. And so the DNR rescinded that sale, knowing that there was old growth that they needed to protect, and because of some public outcry around that. And Public Lands Commissioner Hillary Franz, who heads the DNR, was part of that decision to rescind the entire sale. So at that point, then it went back. But I guess I would clarify the language there. Not that it went back to the public, because these are our state trust lands. So they're public lands. Anyone can access them at any time. And when the DNR does do a timber sale, they still are the purchaser of the timber. the company comes in and they do their logging and they have a contract, and they also have to file or follow all these environmental regulations and such. And then they have, I think it's usually about a 2-year contract to complete harvest and any of the work done after that. And then there's replanting that's done on those lands, and they are still part of the state trust lands. They don't become the timber companies.
Right. So they're not really selling the land. They're just selling the right to harvest the timber from the land, right?
Exactly.
And is it up to the DNR or the company that's been doing the harvesting to replant and reforest? Or is it a combination of both?
I believe it's usually a combination of both, and it's set about in the individual contracts which the DNR prepares for each timber parcel or sale, however you want to word it. And basically, once that contract starts with the timber company that's doing the harvest, it's their responsibility to follow any of those environmental procedures, which might be replanting, reforestation. But the DNR is overseeing that. There's contract managers that are still involved. So the DNR is involved at all steps of the process, if that answers your question.
Yeah. So, these various groups that have been filing lawsuits and claiming the DNR isn't managing the lands properly, and that their estimates are off and all that stuff. In a nutshell, sort of how is the DNR responding to all that? What have they told you as you've been reporting this story?
Right. Well, so a couple of different issues at play and what they've responded to. And I would say, their overarching comment or response to all of the concerns that the public has had is that these trust lands are, held for the benefit of all the people of Washington, because the revenue supports public institutions that most of us interact with in some way in our lifetimes living in the state. That's their interpretation of the Constitution, and that's how they have acted policy-wise since the beginning of Washington state, is to manage these trust lands for the beneficiaries. And so to them, that's the management practices that they're taking. They're doing timber harvest, generating revenue and such. And so when folks have, concerns about that, that's been their response. And in terms of conservation efforts and following perhaps this HCP, that's when it gets a little bit more in the weeds. But the DNR, they have those policies. They have the board that overviews everything that they do. And they would say that they're following the policies. Like I said earlier, the HCP, they call those projections goals. So, for them, their management practices are moving along those lines. But I guess their response would be that they're doing everything on the books right and policy-wise right. There also is a large portion of DNR lands that are still conserved. And so, they've often answered that too, that they don't harvest old growth. There's older forests that have been conserved, for habitat protection and for other reasons, watershed interaction and such. And so I think that, they feel like they're doing everything right in terms of their policies and such.
What's the total amount of land that the DNR is managing?
The total amount, oh my gosh, that's a good question. Across the state or in Western Washington?
I'm trying to remember. I think in one of your stories you said it was something like 3 million acres total. Is that for Western Washington or?
Yeah, let me think. I'd have to go back and look now. That's and that's specifically the trust lands.
Got it. Okay. All right. You talked about how, there's different groups that get the money from this, and one of them is the K through 12 education system. Right. And I understand from the stories that you've written, there's some question about the efficacy of that. That there's some school officials that are saying the money really isn't helping us as much as people think it is.
Right.
How does that play into everything?
Yeah, that's part of it, because Chris Rakedahl is the Washington State Superintendent of Public Instruction. So he's in charge of K-12 schools for the state, and he sits on the Board of Natural Resources. So he has a vote, and he's in these conversations each month about timber harvest. And he, over the past year or so, has really started questioning and responding to some of the public's concerns about these timber harvests by looking at the revenue that is generated for K-12 schools. And we talk about this a little bit later in the series, but basically, to summarize, the revenue for K-12 school construction, which is what their trust land revenue goes towards, has declined in recent years. And schools, when they're doing school construction or improvements to facilities, there's other ways that they get money to do that through bonds and such. But Chris Rakedahl's opinion is, the schools shouldn't have to rely on timber harvest. I think he has talked about that it's not as sustainable an industry as, these questions are coming up with climate change. And do we need to be protecting older forests more for carbon sequestration and carbon storage? And so his opinion, as someone that heads K-12 schools, is that the state should ensure funding for schools in a more sustainable, reliable way, and not relying on timber harvest. And he's spoken very frequently about that during Board of Natural Resources meetings and on the record. And so it's interesting because his institution, quote unquote, is one of the beneficiaries of these trust lands. But I think he is questioning, is there a better way?
All right. And this all seems to have cropped up in the last couple of years. Was there, before all this, was there any serious questioning of, how the DNR was managing the lands, or, whether their mission was constitutional or not?
Yeah. In my reporting, it does focus on these past few years, and I'll say this. I think folks have often raised issue with timber harvest. I talk about in the introduction for this story, Washingtonians really love trees in forested areas. And there was, the timber wars that happened around the 90s, folks might remember. But the reason why this has become such a serious and frequent raised issue, specifically at these public Board of Natural Resources meetings, my understanding is that it started within these past few years when the lands that were being conserved and thus the lands that were being harvested changed. And folks were starting to see older forests, bigger trees being harvested near them in Western Washington, and were concerned about why that was happening and why this change. And the timeline, 2019 is when the suit was an original suit filed against the DNR regarding the establishment of the Marbled Murrelet Amendment in the HCP. And that suit actually was from some counties that were saying the DNR now wasn't going to be harvesting enough and there wasn't going to be enough revenue. And hearing that lawsuit, environmental groups raised the issue of what are they really managing, just for these trust beneficiaries? And it seems to be about revenue. So then they raised their lawsuit that has gone on to the Supreme Court. So that's really when this current debate all begins. And I think it's when folks started to coin this term legacy forests and look into the ages of some of these stands.
All right, and we have another question. Any idea on whether these forests are tribal sovereign lands that are under treaties that haven't been recognized?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dory. Thank you so much for asking. And I think it's an important part of this conversation. And to be frank, in my reporting, I haven't focused much on if these lands that are being harvested are tribal lands with treaties that aren't being recognized, specifically that. There have been certain groups that have, called attention to indigenous practices and engagement with these forests and how that's something that should be respected in part of the conversation for the benefit of all the people and not timber harvest. So to be fair, I can't answer if any of them are on tribal lands with treaties that aren't being recognized, but it's something I'd love to look into.
All right, and then last question, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. And I know you're going to get into this in some of the stories that are coming up, but from what you've told me, there have been a couple of setbacks for the conservation groups in terms of courts kind of kicking out their lawsuits.
Yes. Yeah. So let's see, we're going to talk about that in a few weeks, and perhaps there will even be changes by then. What we know now is that there was 3 lawsuits of those 6 that were filed by the Center for Responsible Forestry in Grays Harbor County. And those lawsuits were by the county judge. Let's see, the word that they used was dismissed in their ruling, but the word that the Center for Responsible Forestry would want to say is denied their appeal to basically sue the DNR for these timber sales. And they haven't issued out any final ruling on that, because my understanding from engagement with the Center for Responsible Forestry and listening in on the court, the oral arguments, was that the court has said it's up to DNR to kind of, as the expertise on the matter of timber harvest and logging in the state, to determine whether they're following their policies. And so it's at this level, at the Superior Court level, it's not something that the court feels like they can rule on. So not to say that they're saying that the Center for Responsible Forestry is wrong or the Department of Natural Resources on, but at this point they're turning it back and saying basically you have to figure it out amongst yourself, if that makes sense, which is really interesting. Yeah.
So basically they're saying we're not sure that this is under our jurisdiction to make a determination. All right. Lauren, thank you for the time. It's a fascinating issue. The first 3 stories are already published on NWPB.org. Every Wednesday for the next few weeks, we'll be continuing to see your reports. So we're looking forward to those. Thanks.
Thank you so much.